Daniel Hayes woke before sunrise, as he always did. The quiet of the frontier land was something he had grown used to over the years. The wide sky above his ranch always looked soft and calm at dawn, as if nothing bad could ever touch the place. Daniel saddled his horse with slow, steady movements. He planned a short hunt that morning, not because he needed the meat urgently, but because the fences around his land needed repair later in the day. A hunt helped him clear his mind before long hours of work. He lived alone, far from town, and silence was something he understood well. The air was cool when he rode out. The grass carried drops of dew, and the distant mountains looked blue in the early light. Daniel followed a trail near an old dry riverbed where animals often crossed. His horse stepped carefully over rocks and fallen branches. Daniel held his rifle loosely, not expecting much, just enjoying the morning. For him, the land felt like a long-time companion, quiet, steady, and honest. He tracked a set of deer prints, moving slowly through the brush. He listened to the sounds around him, the birds, the wind, even the silence between each sound. He was halfway between the hills and the riverbed when he heard something strange. It wasn't the light step of a deer or the soft movement of a rabbit. It was heavier, sharper, almost like someone trying not to make noise. Daniel stopped instantly. His horse lifted its ears, alert and uneasy. Daniel scanned the trees and rocks. He had lived long enough on the frontier to know that unexpected sounds could mean danger. It could be a wild animal, a stray dog, or even a thief hiding and waiting for the right moment. Daniel moved toward the sound slowly, every sense sharp. He didn't want trouble, but he also couldn't ignore the possibility of danger so close to his land. As he moved closer, he heard a faint rustle. Something or someone shifted behind a large cluster of rocks near the dry riverbed. Daniel tightened his grip on his rifle but didn't lift it yet. He didn't want to scare anyone or anything without knowing what it was. He took a careful step forward, his boots quiet against the dirt. When he reached the side of the rock formation, he peered around the edge. What he saw made him freeze. A young Apache woman crouched low behind the rocks. She looked exhausted, her clothes dusty and torn. Her dark hair was tangled, and her skin showed signs of scrapes and bruises, as if she had been running or fighting through rough land. Her eyes, however, were sharp with alertness and pride. She held a small stone in her hand, clearly prepared to defend herself, even though the stone could do little against a rifle. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Neither moved. Daniel felt a wave of surprise wash through him. He had expected almost anything except this. He knew tensions in the region were high, and seeing an Apache woman alone and injured was troubling. She looked afraid, but she hid it well, holding her chin high as if she refused to show weakness. Daniel spoke softly, hoping not to frighten her. "I'm not here to harm you." But she didn't seem to understand his words. Her expression didn't change. Daniel realized she might not speak English, or maybe she simply didn't trust him, which would be understandable. He lowered his rifle slowly but kept it close, just in case. He took a step back to show he meant no harm. The woman shifted slightly, wincing as if something in her leg hurt. Daniel saw her difficulty and understood she was injured. She couldn't run even if she wanted to. He hesitated. The frontier was harsh, and leaving her alone out there was dangerous. She could be attacked by wild animals, or she might collapse from exhaustion. But helping her could invite trouble. If soldiers or local settlers saw him with her, questions would rise. Misunderstandings could follow. People were quick to judge during tense times, and Daniel lived alone with no one to defend him if things went wrong. But Daniel was not a man who turned away from someone in need, no matter who they were. His parents had raised him with strong values, and leaving someone to suffer felt wrong. After another long moment, he made a decision he knew would change the direction of his day, and possibly his life. He put his rifle on the ground and lifted his hands a little to show he wasn't trying to attack. Then he stepped slowly toward her. She stiffened but didn't try to run. Daniel spoke again, gently, hoping tone alone would communicate something. "You're hurt. Let me help." Still, she said nothing, but her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Daniel knew she needed safety more than anything. He carefully reached for a piece of rope tied to his saddle. He didn't want to restrain her, but he also didn't know if she might panic and throw herself into danger. When he approached, she tried to back away, but her injured leg made her stumble. Daniel caught her before she fell, supporting her weight carefully. She tensed under his hands, but she did not struggle. Daniel tied her hands loosely, not tight enough to cause pain, but firm enough to stop her from hurting herself or him. She watched every movement he made, but she did not fight. There was resignation in her eyes, but also something else. A test, maybe, as if she was waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. He lifted her gently onto his horse. She looked puzzled, almost confused. Daniel mounted behind her, making sure she didn't fall. He rode slowly back toward his ranch, keeping his movements gentle, as if he were guiding a skittish animal that might bolt at any moment. The journey back was quiet, except for the sound of the horse's steps and the rustling wind through the grass. Daniel could feel the tension in the woman's body. She held herself stiffly, not leaning into him even though she was tired. He respected her strength and her pride. He did not speak much, knowing she didn't understand him, but he kept his voice calm whenever he said anything. When the ranch finally came into view, Daniel slowed the horse. His home stood alone against the open sky, a modest house with a barn and a small fenced area for animals. It wasn't much, but it was safe, and today that mattered more than ever. He carefully helped the woman down from the horse. She tried to stand on her own but nearly fell again. Daniel supported her without saying anything, guiding her toward the small storage shed beside his house. It was warm, dry, and private, a safe place to rest until he figured out what to do next. Inside, he set her down gently on a pile of clean hay. She watched him with steady eyes, still unsure of his intentions. Daniel untied her wrists and stepped back to give her space. She rubbed the marks left by the rope but didn't lash out or run. She was too weak, but she also seemed to sense that he wasn't trying to harm her. Daniel brought her a small cup of water. She hesitated, eyeing the cup as if it might be a trick. But when Daniel took a sip first to show it was safe, she slowly reached out and accepted it. Her hands trembled slightly as she drank. Daniel sat across from her, giving her enough distance to feel comfortable. He studied her quietly. She was young, perhaps not much younger than him, and though she was injured and tired, he could see the strength in her features. She had the look of someone who had fought hard to survive. As the morning sun warmed the shed, Daniel knew he had made the right decision. He didn't know her story yet. He didn't know why she was alone, hurt, and hiding. But he knew one thing for certain. Leaving her out there would have been wrong. What he didn't know was how deeply this choice would change his quiet life. The woman sitting before him, silent but unbroken, was about to become a turning point he never expected. Daniel checked on the Apache woman several times throughout the day. Each time he entered the shed, she watched him carefully, her eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. She still did not speak, and he didn't expect her to. She had every reason to be cautious. She had been found alone, injured, and far from her people. Daniel knew she was scared, even though she didn't show it openly. Her silence felt like a shield she used to protect herself. When the sun rose higher, Daniel brought her a bowl of warm broth he had made. He placed it near her without moving too close. She hesitated at first, studying both Daniel and the bowl. Only when she felt sure it was safe did she begin to eat, taking slow, careful sips. Daniel noticed her hands were still unsteady, her body weak from days without proper food or rest. He wanted to help more, but he also didn't want to overwhelm her. After she finished, Daniel spoke softly, even though he knew she might not understand. "You're safe here. I won't harm you." He hoped she could at least feel the kindness in his voice. She didn't reply, but she lowered her gaze slightly, as if acknowledging his words in her own way. Later that afternoon, Daniel stepped outside to gather some clean water. The wind carried dust across the ranch, and the sun made the earth glow warm and golden. As Daniel worked, he found himself thinking more about the woman. He wondered how she had ended up so far from her people. He wondered if she had been running from danger or if she had been separated during some kind of conflict. The frontier often held stories that were painful, stories of loss, fear, and misunderstanding. Daniel didn't want to judge too quickly. He only knew she needed safety, and he could provide that, at least for now. He walked back into the shed with a small cloth and a bucket of clean water. The woman immediately tensed, her eyes narrowing. Daniel raised his hands a little, showing the cloth and water. "You're hurt. I want to clean the wounds," he said gently. She still didn't understand his words, but she could see his actions. He moved slowly, giving her time to see that he meant no harm. She didn't fight when he knelt beside her. Daniel carefully cleaned the scrapes along her arms and legs. He worked with steady hands, making sure he didn't hurt her. She flinched a few times when the water touched a deeper cut, but she didn't pull away. Daniel admired her strength. Even injured, she held herself with dignity. When he finished cleaning her wounds, she whispered something softly in her native language. He didn't understand, but the tone was calm, almost gentle. Daniel realized it might have been a small sign of trust, or at least acknowledgement. The afternoon passed slowly. Daniel spent time tending to his animals, repairing a gate and checking supplies. Every so often, his mind drifted back to the shed. The presence of another person on his ranch felt strange after so many years alone, but it didn't feel unwelcome. Instead, it felt like a quiet change he couldn't explain. Near sunset, Daniel prepared a simple dinner: cornbread, beans, and a bit of smoked meat. He brought a portion to the woman. She accepted the food with more confidence this time, as if she had decided he wasn't going to harm her. Daniel watched her eat, noticing how hunger made her movements faster than before, but still controlled. She seemed determined not to appear weak. When she finished, Daniel tried speaking again. "My name is Daniel." He touched his chest to show he meant himself. "Daniel." She studied him for a moment before touching her own chest lightly. "Taya," she said softly. Daniel repeated the name with care. "Taya." She gave a small nod, confirming it. That one exchange, just two names, felt like a bridge being built between them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Daniel felt relieved. He didn't know her story yet, but now she had a name, and names had power. They made strangers feel real. They made silence feel less cold. The evening grew cooler. Daniel lit a small oil lamp in the shed and set it on a box so Taya wouldn't sit in darkness. She watched him with softer eyes than before. Her body seemed more relaxed, though she still sat upright, ready for anything. Daniel respected her strength and her caution. Anyone who survived alone on this land needed both. Before leaving the shed for the night, Daniel gestured to the small pile of blankets he had placed nearby. "For warmth," he said, gently pushing them closer. Taya didn't speak, but she reached for one, pulling it around her shoulders slowly. It was the first time she accepted something without hesitation. Daniel stepped outside, closing the door behind him but not locking it. He didn't want her to feel trapped. He returned to his house, but sleep didn't come easily. His thoughts kept drifting to Taya. He wondered what danger she had faced, who she had lost, and what she feared most. The land was full of dangers, from the harsh weather to the fear between settlers and Apache. Taya's presence on his ranch could easily lead to trouble, but Daniel didn't regret bringing her in. It was the right thing to do, no matter how complicated it might become. The next morning came with a soft wind and the smell of dust and sage. Daniel walked to the shed with fresh water and a bit of bread. When he opened the door, he found Taya sitting up. Her posture alert but not tense. She looked stronger than she had the day before. Daniel offered her the water and bread, and she accepted them quietly. He noticed she tried to stand. Her injured leg shook a little, but she held onto the wall for balance. Daniel moved closer, ready to help, but stopped when she gave him a firm look. She didn't want help unless it was necessary. Daniel stepped back, respecting her choice. She took a few shaky steps around the shed, testing her strength. After a few minutes, she seemed tired, so Daniel brought a small stool for her to rest on. She sat, breathing slowly as if gathering energy. Daniel decided that fresh air might help her heal faster. He pointed outside, then to her, hoping she would understand that he wanted her to see the ranch. Taya hesitated, but then nodded. Daniel opened the door wide and stepped aside. She walked out slowly, leaning slightly to one side because of her leg. The sunlight touched her face, and she closed her eyes briefly, as if she had missed the feeling of being in the open. Daniel led her to a shaded area near the barn. She sat on a wooden bench while he worked nearby, repairing a fence post. He didn't speak much, wanting her to feel calm. Taya watched him with quiet curiosity, as if trying to understand the kind of man he was. She seemed to relax as the morning went on. Their peaceful moment was suddenly broken by the sound of distant voices. Daniel looked up sharply. Two men, neighbors from a ranch a few miles away, were riding toward his property. Daniel's stomach tightened. He wasn't expecting visitors, and this could turn dangerous if they saw Taya. He turned to her quickly. She sensed the change in his behavior immediately. Daniel whispered, "Hide," pointing to the barn. She didn't understand his words, but she understood his hand gesture. Without a sound, Taya moved quickly, slipping into the barn and disappearing behind stacks of hay. Daniel rushed to meet the neighbors before they could reach the shed or barn. He greeted them calmly, forcing a relaxed smile. The men talked about recent news, rumors of Apache sightings, tension in town, and missing livestock. Daniel kept his answers short, careful, and steady. He didn't mention Taya, and he didn't let his eyes drift toward the barn. After a long and tense conversation, the neighbors finally rode away. Daniel waited until they were out of sight before breathing out in relief. He walked back to the barn and opened the door quietly. Taya stepped out from behind the hay, her eyes questioning. Daniel nodded gently, trying to calm her. "It's all right now." She didn't know the words, but she understood the meaning. She looked at him for a long moment, and something changed in her expression. It was small, almost hidden, but it was there, a growing trust. Daniel realized that protecting her wasn't just a choice anymore. It was a responsibility he felt deeply, and Taya, in her quiet and cautious way, seemed to understand that he was not her enemy. Neither of them knew it yet, but this uneasy beginning was turning into something far more meaningful, something that would shape the days that followed and change them both in ways they could not imagine. The days that followed passed quietly, but something had clearly begun to change between Daniel and Taya. At first, they were only two people sharing the same land, one cautious, the other patient. But time has a way of softening fear, especially when kindness is shown again and again without expecting anything in return. Taya grew stronger each day. The color returned to her cheeks, and she was able to walk without holding on to the walls or posts. She still moved carefully, but she no longer looked like someone who might collapse at any moment. Daniel noticed every small improvement, and each one made him feel strangely relieved. He told himself it was because he wanted her to recover so she could return to her people safely. But deep inside, he knew it was more than that. He cared about her well-being, even though he barely knew her story. One morning, Daniel walked outside early to feed the horses. He was surprised to find Taya already standing near the wooden fence, watching the sunrise. She stood still, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were listening to the land breathe. Daniel approached slowly so he wouldn't startle her. She turned her head slightly when she sensed him but didn't move away. This alone felt like progress. He handed her a small piece of dried fruit. She accepted it with a small nod, a gesture that carried quiet gratitude. They ate side by side without speaking, facing the open land that stretched to the hills. It was a simple moment, but it felt peaceful, like they were beginning to understand each other without needing many words. Over the next few days, Taya began helping Daniel with small tasks around the ranch. She swept the shed, carried light buckets of water, and even tried to help fix a broken fence post. Daniel tried to stop her at first, worried her leg might worsen, but she gave him a firm look that clearly meant she wanted to work. She did not want to be seen as helpless. Daniel respected that, stepping back and letting her show her strength. Working together brought them closer. She watched how he handled tools, how he talked to the horses softly, and how he studied the weather by looking at the sky. Sometimes she asked simple questions in broken English, pointing to things and trying to learn the words. Daniel did his best to teach her, speaking slowly and clearly, repeating words until she could say them. In return, she taught him a few of her own words, names of birds, plants, and simple greetings. Their lessons were slow, sometimes confusing, but always gentle. Each shared word felt like a small bridge between two very different worlds. One afternoon, while Taya gathered firewood near the barn, Daniel sat nearby sharpening his tools. She suddenly paused, looking at a small plant growing between two stones. She crouched down and touched its leaves gently, speaking an Apache word Daniel didn't know. She picked a few leaves, held them to her nose, and then brought them to him, pointing to the small cut on his hand from earlier. She wanted to help him. He held out his hand, and she pressed the leaves gently onto the cut, wrapping it with a soft strip of cloth she tore from her own sleeve. Her hands were warm and careful. Daniel felt a strange, quiet warmth spreading through him, not from the plant, but from the kindness in her actions. This time, the silence between them didn't feel distant. It felt like understanding. Later that evening, while they sat outside watching the sky turn orange, Taya finally shared a part of her story. Her English was still limited, but Daniel listened with patience, filling in gaps with his imagination. She told him about a storm that separated her from her people. She spoke of bandits who attacked the area afterward, forcing her to run and hide. She had not known if her brother survived, and for days she had wandered with no food, no shelter, and little hope. Her voice remained steady, but Daniel could see the pain behind her calm expression. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions that might hurt her. He simply listened. When she finished, she looked away as if embarrassed by her own vulnerability. Daniel quietly said, "I'm sorry you went through that." She didn't fully understand his words, but she felt the emotion in them. She nodded slowly, accepting the comfort he offered. As days passed, the bond between them grew in a quiet, natural way. They began to rely on each other. Daniel had someone who understood silence the same way he did, and Taya had someone who offered safety without expecting repayment. They worked together, walked the ranch together, and even shared small smiles that once seemed impossible. But the peace didn't last forever. The world outside the ranch was restless, and tension in the region was growing. Rumors spread through nearby towns about more Apache sightings. People were nervous, and nervous people often acted without thinking. Soldiers rode from camp to camp, checking ranches and asking questions. One afternoon, Daniel heard distant hoofbeats. He stood at the top of the hill near his barn and saw a group of soldiers riding toward his property. His stomach tightened. Taya was inside the barn sorting a bundle of firewood. He rushed toward her, his voice low but urgent. She immediately sensed danger in his tone, even if she didn't understand the words. He motioned for her to hide. She didn't hesitate this time. She moved quickly behind stacks of hay and supplies, disappearing in seconds. Daniel pushed a wooden crate in front of the space to help hide her even more. When he looked into her eyes, he saw fear, but he also saw trust. She trusted him to protect her. That trust weighed heavily on Daniel's heart. He stepped outside just as the soldiers arrived. Their leader greeted him sharply, asking if Daniel had seen anyone unusual. Daniel kept his expression calm, though inside his heart beat fast. "No one here but me," he replied, steady as ever. The soldiers looked around, scanning the land, eyes sharp for any sign of outsiders. They asked to check his barn. Daniel forced himself to remain calm. He walked with them, praying silently that Taya stayed hidden. One soldier poked at hay piles with the end of his rifle. Another walked around the walls, checking corners. Daniel felt sweat collect at the back of his neck, but he kept his breathing steady. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the soldiers stepped outside again. The leader nodded politely. "Stay alert. Apache scouts may be nearby." Daniel nodded, his voice controlled. "I will." When they rode away, Daniel didn't relax until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Only then did he rush to the barn and move the crate aside. Taya stepped out slowly, her eyes wide with worry. Daniel looked at her, his expression softening. "It's all right now," he said quietly. She didn't know the words, but she understood the relief in his tone. She touched her chest lightly, then pointed to him, a gesture of gratitude. Daniel nodded, feeling something deepen inside him. He knew then that protecting her was no longer just a choice. It had become something he felt strongly, something personal. After that day, Taya stayed close to Daniel, sensing the danger that hovered around them. Their conversations grew a little easier, their silence more comfortable. Daniel realized that they were no longer two strangers forced together by chance. They were becoming something else, companions, partners in survival, and perhaps something even more meaningful that neither dared to name yet. But deeper changes were coming, changes that would test their courage, shake their emotions, and bring them closer than either expected. The days after the soldiers' visit were filled with a quiet tension that neither Daniel nor Taya spoke about out loud. Even though the danger had passed for the moment, both of them understood that the world outside the ranch was changing fast. Rumors of conflict grew stronger. Settlers were nervous. Apache scouts were moving through the hills more often. Every sound of distant hoofbeats made Daniel tense, and every notice of dust on the horizon made Taya turn her head sharply. But despite the uneasy atmosphere, their lives settled into a calm routine again. Daniel repaired fences, tended animals, and cut firewood. Taya helped whenever her strength allowed. Her injured leg was healing, but she still walked with a careful step. She refused to stay idle. She gathered herbs, swept the barn, and cleaned tools. She wanted to be useful, and Daniel never stopped her unless she pushed herself too hard. Sometimes, when the work was light, they walked together around the edge of the ranch. Taya showed Daniel plants that could heal, pointing to leaves and telling him their Apache names. He repeated them in his slow way, making her smile when he mispronounced something. In return, he taught her more English words. She learned them quickly, storing each one carefully as if it were important. These shared lessons, spoken in soft voices under the open sky, created a small world between them that felt safe, despite the dangers around them. Still, Daniel sensed something changing in Taya. She stared at the distant hills more often, her expression thoughtful and troubled. Sometimes she pressed her fingers into the soft dirt, drawing patterns that meant something to her. Other times she sat silently near the barn, her eyes full of memories Daniel could not see. One afternoon, while Daniel was mending a gate, he noticed an object carved into a tree near the far fence. It looked like a symbol made with a sharp stone, a simple pattern that did not belong to nature. Taya stood close to the tree, her body still, her face pale. When Daniel approached, she touched the carving gently, whispering something in Apache. The sound of her voice carried emotion, a mixture of surprise and sorrow. Daniel asked quietly, "You know this?" She nodded slowly. "My people," she said in simple English. She pressed her palm against the mark as if it were a message left for her. Daniel realized that her tribe had been close enough to leave a sign. Taya's world, the one she thought she had lost, was not as far away as she believed. That night, Taya barely slept. Daniel heard her pacing inside the shed, her steps soft but restless. When he checked on her, she sat on the small stool with her hands pressed together, her eyes troubled. She didn't speak, and Daniel didn't push. He knew she was searching inside herself for what to do next. In the days that followed, Daniel sensed her heart pulling in two directions. She worked beside him. She shared meals. She listened to his words. But her thoughts were somewhere beyond the hills. Each sunset made her quiet. Each sunrise made her anxious. Daniel felt the distance growing, even though she stood right beside him. He understood why. She had a life before she came to his ranch. She had a family, a tribe, a world that belonged to her. She had lost them once, and now she felt the small possibility that they were still out there. Daniel respected that. He knew she didn't belong to him and he had no right to keep her. But understanding didn't make the thought of losing her any easier. One morning, while Daniel was bringing water from the well, Taya approached him with a serious expression. She spoke slowly, choosing her English words carefully. "I need to go," she said. Her voice was steady but soft. Daniel felt a quiet pain settle in his chest, but he did not show it. He had expected this moment. He nodded, speaking gently. "Your people?" "Yes," she said. She looked down, then lifted her head again. "I must find them." Daniel placed the bucket aside, wiping his hands on his shirt. He took a slow breath. "I understand." A sadness crossed her face, quick but visible. "You helped me," she said. "You saved me." Daniel shook his head softly. "Anyone would have helped." Taya looked at him in a way that told him she didn't believe that. Her eyes held gratitude mixed with something deeper, respect, trust, maybe even something she didn't know how to name. Daniel helped her gather what she needed for the journey. He packed a small bag with dried food, a blanket, and a canteen. Taya watched him, silent and thoughtful. She tied the bag around her shoulder, then stood still, as if waiting for something she didn't know how to say. When it was time to leave, they walked together to the edge of the ranch, where the land opened into the rolling hills. The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of grass and dust. Daniel stopped, his heart heavy but calm. Taya looked at him with eyes full of emotion. She lifted her hand and touched his arm lightly, a gesture of thanks and goodbye. Daniel looked at her and spoke slowly, wanting her to understand every word. "If you ever need shelter again, this place is open to you." Taya took a long breath, and her eyes glowed softly. "Daniel." "Good man," she said, her voice trembling for the first time since he met her. Then she stepped back, turned toward the hills, and walked away with determined steps. Daniel watched until she disappeared into the distance. The ranch suddenly felt too quiet, too still. The sky looked the same, the land looked the same, but everything felt different. He walked back to the house slowly, feeling the emptiness settle around him like a heavy coat. For weeks he had grown used to her presence, the soft footsteps, the quiet questions, the shared moments near the barn. Now the silence felt cold. The next day, Daniel worked harder than usual, trying to keep his mind busy. He fixed fences, stacked firewood, brushed the horses, cleaned tools, anything to fill the long hours. But no amount of work erased the feeling that something important had walked away from his life. Evenings were the hardest. He found himself staring at the shed where she had first rested, remembering her quiet strength and the way she looked at the sky as if searching for answers. At night, he listened to the wind, wondering if she was safe, if she had found her people, if she remembered him at all. 2 days passed, then 3, then a week. Daniel tried to accept that their paths had gone separate ways. She belonged with her tribe, and he belonged on his ranch. That was the truth, even if it created a quiet ache inside him. But life had one more surprise waiting. One warm afternoon, Daniel was repairing a fence near the road when he heard movement beyond the hill. He lifted his head, expecting a stray cow or maybe a rider. Instead, he saw several figures walking toward the ranch, Apache warriors, strong and proud, moving in calm formation. Daniel's heart jumped, but he didn't run or reach for his rifle. He stood still, waiting. Then he saw her. Taya walked beside them, looking stronger, cleaner, and more confident than when she had left. Her eyes found Daniel instantly. The warrior stopped a short distance away. Taya stepped forward, holding herself with dignity. Daniel felt the breath leave his chest, but he managed to speak softly. "You came back." Taya nodded slowly. "Yes." Behind her, the Apache chief stepped closer, studying Daniel with sharp, steady eyes. But instead of hostility, there was calm respect. Taya had told her people the truth, and she had returned, not because she had to, but because something inside her wanted to. The moment was small and quiet, but it changed everything. Daniel stood still as the group of Apache warriors approached, unsure of what their arrival meant. The warm afternoon light fell across the land, making every detail sharp. The wind brushing the tall grass, the horses shifting behind him, the soft dust rising near the trail. But Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on just one person, Taya. She walked with calm steps beside her people, her back straight, her expression strong. She no longer looked like the injured, frightened woman he had found behind the rocks. Her clothes were clean and traditional, decorated with simple designs. Her hair was neatly braided, and her face carried the confidence of someone who had found her place again. But her eyes, when they rested on Daniel, carried a softness he remembered well. The warriors stopped several feet away, forming a respectful but guarded line. Daniel felt the tension, but he kept his hands loose by his sides. He did not reach for his rifle or look away in fear. He met their gaze with steady calm. Then the Apache chief stepped forward. He was an older man with sharp features, wearing a woven band around his forehead. His eyes studied Daniel with quiet intelligence. He did not speak immediately, which made the air grow heavy with expectation. Taya looked between the chief and Daniel, then spoke softly in her native language. Her voice carried warmth and calm respect. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but he felt the emotion behind them. She was explaining. She was telling them what had happened. She was telling them about him. When she finished, the chief nodded slowly, then looked at Daniel. "You helped her," the chief said in accented but clear English. Daniel swallowed lightly and nodded. "She was hurt. She needed safety." "You did not give her to soldiers," the chief added, watching Daniel closely. "You protected her." Daniel nodded again, his voice steady. It was the right thing to do. The chief studied him longer, then turned to speak with 2 of the warriors. Their conversation was brief, but Daniel sensed they were discussing him. Finally, the chief stepped forward again. "Taya is our daughter," he said calmly. "We feared she was gone. Her return brought us peace." Daniel's heart tightened. He glanced at Taya, who looked down for a moment, her breath catching as if she were reliving the pain of being lost. "She told us about you," the chief continued. "She told us you helped her heal and that you treated her with respect." Daniel didn't know what to say. He only nodded once more, feeling humbled by the chief's calm words. The chief then took a slow step forward. "We have come to thank you." Few settlers would show kindness in these times. His voice carried a depth that made Daniel straighten his back slightly out of silent respect. Daniel cleared his throat. "You don't need to thank me. I only did what any decent man should do." The chief held his gaze for another long moment, then gave a slight nod as if acknowledging something Daniel didn't realize he had shown. "Still," the chief said, "it matters." Then he stepped aside slightly, revealing Taya more fully. Taya took a breath and walked toward Daniel slowly. Every step felt meaningful. Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken, though his face remained calm. She stood before him, looking up into his eyes with a mix of gratitude, respect, and something deeper, something unspoken but powerful. "I come back," she said softly. Her English was clearer than before. "I come to say goodbye in the right way." The words made Daniel's chest ache. He managed a small nod, unsure how to respond, but Taya wasn't finished. "And I come to thank you." Her voice trembled slightly, showing emotion she had hidden for so long. "You saved me. You kept me safe. You cared." Daniel felt the weight of her words settle over him gently, like a warm blanket. "I'm glad you're safe," he said quietly. "That's what matters most." Taya studied his face carefully, reading everything he didn't say. Then she stepped a little closer. "I told my people, you are a good man, a brave man, a man who listens to the land." She paused, searching for more words. "They believe me." Daniel's eyes softened. "I'm honored." Behind her, the warriors stood calmly, showing no sign of hostility. Some even looked curious. The chief watched them with a thoughtful expression. Then the chief spoke again. "You are welcome to visit our camp, if you choose." Daniel blinked in surprise. "Visit?" "Yes," the chief said. "You helped one of ours. So you are not an enemy. You may travel to us without fear." This was rare. Such an invitation was nearly unheard of. Daniel understood the honor of it. "I would like that," Daniel said quietly. Taya's eyes brightened just a little. She looked relieved, as if that single moment meant more than words could express. The chief nodded and stepped back, giving Taya room. Daniel felt a sudden heaviness in his chest, knowing the moment of parting was close. He didn't want to make her feel guilty for leaving, but he also couldn't pretend it didn't feel like he was losing something meaningful. Taya sensed it. She reached out and touched his arm lightly. Her fingers were warm, steady, full of sincerity. "I go with my people," she said softly. "But—" she took a slow breath. "I do not forget the ranch. I do not forget you." Daniel swallowed hard, his voice thick but controlled. "I won't forget you either." For a few seconds, they simply looked at each other. The wind blew gently, carrying their quiet emotions through the open land. Then Taya stepped back toward her people. The warriors began to move, walking in an organized line back toward the hills. Daniel watched them go, feeling a mix of sadness and peace. Taya turned once more as she walked, giving him a final nod, a promise in her eyes that their paths had not fully ended. He raised his hand in a quiet farewell. She lifted hers in return. As she disappeared over the hill with her tribe, Daniel remained standing there for a long time, the wind brushing against him softly. He felt the emptiness again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the lonely emptiness of before. It was the feeling of someone who had made a connection, deep, honest, and unforgettable. In the days that followed, Daniel returned to his daily tasks, but the land felt changed. Every time he passed the tree with the carved sign, he remembered Taya's calm smile. Every time he walked by the shed, he remembered her quiet strength. The ranch no longer felt like a place only for one man. It felt like a place touched by a story larger than himself. Weeks later, Daniel found himself looking toward the hills at sunset, wondering where Taya was, wondering if she thought of him too, and he felt sure she did. Their worlds were different, their lives separate, yet their bond remained, a quiet, strong connection shaped by kindness, trust, and the courage they had shown in a difficult time. Daniel knew he might see her again. Maybe someday soon, maybe someday far. But he also knew that whether or not their paths crossed again, his life had changed forever the moment he found her behind those rocks. She had come into his world like a quiet storm, unexpected, powerful, and unforgettable. And she left carrying a part of his heart back into the hills, where he hoped it would stay safe. The ranch was his home, but now it held a story that would stay with him for the rest of his life.